She's a senior lecturer in the Department of Marketing and Entrepreneurship at the University of Ghana School of Business. She holds a doctoral and undergraduate degrees in marketing from the University of Ghana. She is the first female to complete a PhD in marketing from the University of Ghana, and she is also the founder of the Women in Tertiary Education Waiting Network, which she seeks to provide support for women pursuing tertiary education in their academic research, family life, and career balance. It's amazing that she's of the skill in the domain marketing, entrepreneurship, e-learning, and online technologies.
So I believe this is one of many webinars that you will have, but usually in my first instance of meeting students to discuss thesis or research related issues, I like to give them a sense of what is expected of them or what is required if you are to complete successfully a thesis or long essay in the University of Ghana under the College of Humanities or College of Education as a graduate student. Now, in that regard, my presentation is going to take the following outline. I'll first take you through the phases of the research process. So if you are writing a long essay, we are going to go through the phases of that process. Then if you are doing an MPhil or PhD thesis, we will go through the phases of that process as well. And then we'll move on to talk about the outline of the preliminary pages in the chapter 1, which I find in my experience, students make a lot of mistakes on, and the chapter 1 being the foundation of the long essay or the thesis. If you do not get it right, everything else that you do afterwards tends to be foiled, right? Or tends to be a bit of a challenge or difficult because you didn't get the foundations right in the beginning. So we will look at the outline of the preliminary pages in the chapter 1, which has the key ingredients that lay the foundation for the ultimate thesis that you're going to put together. And then finally, we'll talk about writing a compelling research problem or problem statement, right? So these are the 3 things that we will be covering in this session. So let's begin by looking at, if anyone has anything they want to say, please just raise your hand. Ferdinand will draw my attention and then we'll give you the opportunity to speak and express yourself. As much as possible, please try to mute yourself so that you do not give feedback into the recording, so that we can have a good recording to share with members after the session. Great, thank you. Okay, so like I said, let's begin with the phases of the research process. When you are writing a long essay or a thesis, depending on whether you are an MBA or an MPhil student, you'll be writing one of these 2. And for PhD students, it's set, they all write a thesis. Long essays in terms of structure and level of depth and detail cannot be measured on the same scale as a thesis, given the fact that long essays are usually written by students who are writing it alongside coursework. So the level of detail that we expect a student who is writing a thesis full-time to put into their submission or manuscript is not as much as we will expect from a long essay student. So you will notice that long essays in terms of depth and detail are usually a bit more limited as compared with thesis. And that is why the phases of the long essay process are a bit different from that of the thesis writing process. So you can't pick someone's MBA thesis as an MPhil student and say, I'm using that as the backdrop for completing my own thesis. You will be making a mistake because the level of detail and in-depth analysis that is required for a long essay is very different from what is expected of you who is writing a thesis. Please, I hope we understand that point.
Yes, we do.
Good. So in that regard, the phases of the research process for a long essay are a bit different from that of the thesis, and that's why we are going to be discussing them separately. So let's start with the phases of the research process in a long essay. It usually begins with the preliminary pages, which a lot of students take for granted, but is very important because depending on the institution that you are in, there are certain preliminary pages that you have to present and in a particular order. So if you are not able to present these pages in the correct format and order, it means that you are not fully satisfying the requirements of the long essay as is expected. Please, I hope you understand that point.
Yes, please.
On that note, I'd like to ask, are you aware that the graduate school has a set outline for which preliminary pages should be presented and in what order they should be presented? Are we aware of that?
No, please.
You are not? Okay. So newsflash, the graduate school has a set standard for how preliminary pages should be presented and the order in which they should be presented, right? So we are going to go through that outline very soon, and that is why there's a whole section on the presentation of the preliminary pages and the chapter 1, right? So when we get there, we will delve deeper into the structure of the preliminary pages and the order in which they should be presented, right? But for now, in terms of the long essay, the first thing you need to think about in the process and structuring the long essay is the preliminary pages, which should come in the correct order and in the correct format. Then after that, you move to the chapter 1. And the chapter 1 is the introduction of your long essay. Now, the introduction, first of all, has to identify a social or business phenomenon that you want to study, right? Because we are in the humanities, we are in education. So we are basically dealing with social issues, right? So you have to identify the problem that has to be studied and give us an anecdotal impetus for studying it, right? Meaning that you can't just go in straight into literature when you are beginning with your introduction in the long essay in chapter 1. You have to first of all identify the issue and then give us some kind of background into why this issue is important and what problem you have identified with this issue that you want to go into studying. So without doing this, you cannot move forward and do anything else because that is the basis for why you are doing the entire long essay in the first place. So the introduction must tell us the issue you want to study, give us the background of that issue, usually from an anecdotal perspective with real world example. And this is where you pull on statistics from anecdotal evidence that has been presented in relation to the issue that you are studying. And with that anecdotal evidence, you now move into the literature backing or justification for why you want to do that study. And that is where we get to the research problem or the problem statement, which we are going to discuss into detail in a moment. So from the background, you go into the research problem, which, if I might add, you cannot be able to write effectively if you do not know what is in the literature. And from experience, this is the number one problem that I realized a lot of graduate students have. They do not necessarily know what is in the literature regarding the topics or the areas that they want to study. They usually sample and pick 1 or 2 articles that have been written in the area, which sometimes you like to use the term they have fallen in love with, perhaps based on the kind of framework that the people used or how phenomenal they believe the topic that the authors covered is, and stick to those in putting together the research problem. But that doesn't help because it gives us a myopic view of the issue that you are trying to address and does not give us enough justification for why you are building a whole long essay around this particular issue or area. So before you can write a good research problem or problem statement, you need to have a solid grasp of the literature in the area that you are doing the research in. Please, I hope that makes sense.
Yes, please.
So after you have a good research problem, then you can tell us the purpose of your study, because you have given us an idea of what the problem is. And now, based on the problem you have identified, your research purpose will tell us what you are going to do through your study to help us solve that problem, right? So that is why the research purpose comes after the research problem, followed by the specific objectives you will be addressing in your research. And then the research questions, which are the question form of the research objectives that you identified. And then it goes into the significance of the study, which is why your study is so important that you should spend that 1 year period or 2 year or 3 year period studying it. And the significance of the study is usually 3-pronged, meaning it has 3 dimensions or elements. Can you help me name these dimensions of the research significance? Every long essay that you do, every thesis that you write is of significance in 3 main areas. So we have Mohammed Abu Najjar and Hakim Al-Hassan. So Mohammed, give us one.
To add to existing knowledge.
Very good. So the first significance is to add to existing knowledge. And this is the most important one, because this is the one that tells us that the gap that you identified in literature, you are going to do something to try to fill, right? So that is the first and most important one, which is the significance to existing knowledge. What is the second one? Hakim, your hand is down, or Mohammed said what you wanted to say.
No, practice, please.
Practice is the second one, because whatever you are identifying as the research problem that you are going to solve and contribute to knowledge on has real world implications. Because remember, the topic that you are studying is a social phenomenon. So it means that in as much as it is contributing to existing literature, it also has real world implications. And that is the significance to practice. What is the third one? Who can give us the third one?
Doc, policy direction.
Thank you, Nitaki. Policy. Because sometimes, depending on how your topic is phrased and the issues that you are addressing, they may have implications for policy development. But it is important to note that not every research has policy implications. Please, is that noted?
Yes, Doc.
Not
Yes,
every study will have policy implications. However, every single study that you do, because it is a social phenomenon, will have contribution or significance to existing knowledge and a significance to practice. So don't beat yourself up if you can't find a significance to policy that your study is addressing, because it's not every study that will contribute to policy. However, every single study that you do, in as much as it's contributing to existing knowledge, will also have implications for practice. So when you're writing your research significance, you must make sure that all these are clearly outlined. The order does not necessarily matter. Some people will choose to write the significance to practice before the significance to research and the significance to policy, if any. But just make sure that all of these are represented, because these are the ingredients that are required to satisfy the requirements for the significance section in the chapter 1, right? And then after the significance, some researchers will include limitations of the study. But I would not advise that you include limitations of the study in your chapter 1. Can anyone guess why? Can anyone guess why I would not advise you to include limitations of a study in your chapter 1? Okay, Gelda, go ahead.
Yes, Doc. So I'm thinking it's because you are not done with your research yet.
Good.
So there may be some events or incidents that will affect your research at the end of it. So when you put it at the introduction, you might not represent the whole of the limitations that are supposed to be there.
That's a very valid point, Gelda. Very well said. And I think Moses Junior agrees with you. Abdulaziz says the work hasn't been done yet. So stating limitations is basically shooting yourself in the leg, which I totally agree. Moses says because it's too early to know the limitations. I agree to that as well. And Hakim is also making a very strong point where he says it may annul the objectives you seek to achieve, which is a very key point. So I will always advise, save your limitations until you get to the end of your work. and rather introduce them as what? Limitations of the study and directions for what? Directions for what?
Research.
Future research. Right? But Moses is asking a question. Can we anticipate? Yes, you can anticipate, but I will not advise that you include it. Do you know why, Moses? Because as soon as you put limitations in chapter 1, me as the examiner or the reader, you are already psyching me up as to what I'm about to read. So you are introducing caveats even before I have started reading the main work. So it means that there are so many red flags that I have to look out for, because if already you are showing me limitations, it means that you did not do due diligence in attempting to even surmount the limitations that emerged in the work. Moses, I hope that makes sense. So rather than set yourself up for failure, because the moment you introduce limitations, it opens up for, okay, what other shortcomings are there in the work that we need to look out for if he's already talking about limitations at this point? You do not want that. So you want to make sure that you are presenting your research work and the justification for it in the best light. So even though you anticipate some limitations, just keep them in your head. And as you are doing the research, introduce techniques and strategies to try as much as possible to limit the effects of these limitations. So that if by the end of the research you have not been able to overcome them, you just add them in the end as limitations of the overall study and directions for future research. Please, I hope you all understand that point.
Yes, Doc.
Good. So after you talk about the significance and then you talk about the synopsis of the chapters, you now go in to write the substantive chapters, right? Good. So for the long essay, the next substantive chapter you move into is the literature review chapter, where you review existing literature, you explain the concepts that you are studying, and then you go ahead to review the underpinning theories that you will be using for your study and emerge with the ones that directly apply to your study. In my experience, students will go about discussing so many different theses, about 3, 4, or 5. And they'll say this theory does this, and this theory does that, and this theory does this. But in the end, they will not tell us exactly which of the theories they have settled on that is going to be the underpinning theory for their research. So you have to make sure that in the literature review, we usually discuss this under a section called the theoretical foundations, where you are discussing a number of theories you have identified researchers using in the area that you are studying. And then ultimately, by the end of the discussion, tell us which one of those theories you are going to be relying on to conduct your research. Please, I hope that makes sense.
Yes, please.
Sarah Mensah says, can you throw more light on the synopsis? Okay, so the synopsis is basically the chapters that are going to be included in your work and what will be covered in each chapter. So the synopsis will usually say the structure of the thesis is as follows, or the remainder of the thesis will be structured as follows. Chapter 2 will cover the literature review. Chapter 3 will cover the context of the study. Chapter 4 will cover the methodology. Chapter 5 will tell us the data collection and analysis and discussion of the results. And then chapter 6 will be our summary, conclusions, and implications, right? So Sarah, that's basically it. It's the structure of the thesis and the breakdown of the chapters and what they each entail. Like Maud said, that's the organization of the thesis.
Thank you, Doc.
You're welcome, Sarah. Solomon says, is 3 objectives okay for MPhil? It depends on how the objectives are structured and how loaded they are. For thesis writing, MPhil and PhD, there is a level of complexity that we are looking for in the formulation of the research questions and objectives. So even if you have only 2 objectives and the level of complexity is there, it is acceptable. So 2 objectives, 3 objectives, fine. I've seen instances where people have 4, 5 objectives. They are all acceptable as long as the level of difficulty that we are looking for and the level of sophistication in the formulation of the research objectives and questions is there. You are okay, Solomon. So 3 objectives is enough as long as it satisfies the requirements I have just mentioned. Okay, so Sarah says, is there any difference between a conceptual framework and theoretical framework? Yes, there are differences between them, but that is a discussion for a whole nother lecture. So Sarah, let's hope that we get the opportunity to have another section to tackle framework development. Then we will look into the differences between the conceptual framework and the theoretical framework. Miss Mikey? She says, how many theories do you have to review before focusing on one or two for your work? Well, some people will choose not to review different theories. Some people will just go straight in and mention the theory that they are working with. And that is acceptable if you are doing a long essay. However, if you are doing a thesis, you have to conduct what we refer to as a systematic review to review the theories that have been used in the area that you are doing your research before you settle on one. So if you are doing a long essay, Miss Mikey, you can go ahead and just indicate that I am using so-and-so thesis. This is the breakdown of the thesis. These are the logical reasonings behind the thesis. These are the dimensions of theory. These are the dimensions of the theory. This is the logic behind the theory, and this is why I am using it for my work, right? So you can decide to mention one or two theories that you considered and which one you settled on, and then tell us why you settled on it and how it applies to your work if you are doing a long essay. But you can also choose not to do that and then just go in and say, this is the theory underpinning my work, and then just break down and explain the theory and how it applies to your work. But if you are doing an MPhil or a PhD, you are required to review the theories that have been used to a large extent in the area that you are studying, and then settle on one and justify why you settled on that one for your research work. Sir, I think you joined us late because I explained the difference between long essay and thesis. Right? Can someone tell us what I said about the difference between a long essay and a thesis? What did I say is the difference between a long essay and a thesis? You don't remember? Okay, so sir, what I said about the long essay and the thesis is that I said that the long essay is usually written by the students who are combining the research process with coursework. And we usually see this with undergraduates and MBA students, right? And because of that, the level of in-depth detail that is required for a long essay is very different from what is required for a thesis, right? So theses are usually written by research students who are spending their entire time conducting research on a particular topic or area. Right? So we see what Ivana, we can hear you, please. Ferdinand, can you kindly help with the muting?
Madam, please, I'm on it.
Okay. So the thesis is what is written by the research students who devote an entire year to just doing the research alone. And because of that, the level of depth and detail that they are required to cover in the thesis is very high as compared to the long essay, right? So that is the main difference between a long essay and a thesis.
If you're doing MA, can you choose the route of deciding to talk about the various theories underpinning the subject area you are?
Yes, you can.
Okay.
Yes, you can. Sorry, I mentioned MB, I didn't mention MA. Sorry. MAs also do long essay, isn't it, Henry?
Yes.
Yes, so you're free to do so. Great. Okay, should all theories be diagrammatic? No, not all theories are diagrammatic, Sarah. Seth says, what's the difference between literature review and systematic review? We'll cover that in this session, so please hold your horses till then. Eunice says, please, with the organization of the chapters for the thesis, I learned it's a 2-chapter content. Can you please explain that to me? I'm confused. Eunice, you will have to clarify. But I'm sure by the time I finish my presentation, a lot of these things will be clarified. And then you can ask for further explanation if you are still confused. Okay. Great. Emmanuel says, isn't it advisable to write chapter 1 after you are done with your study? No, it is not, Emmanuel. In fact, it is suicide to write chapter 1 after you are done with your study. And it is important for us to note that research is not a one-time thing, right? The long essay or thesis that you are writing is iterative, meaning that as you write the chapters and go on, you will keep going back and forth, fine-tuning and refining what you have written previously. So whatever you write in the beginning is not set in stone. You can come back and modify it, but you need to lay down a chapter 1 to be able to solidify the ideas and the problem statement and the thinking that you are going into the research process with. Otherwise, you are going into the research process without a research problem, without any objectives to guide you, and without a significance that your study is going to contribute to existing knowledge, practice, and policy, which basically means that you don't know what you are doing. You are moving around in circles. So we said chapter 2 is the literature review, where you review existing literature, you explain the concepts and underpinning theories of your study. So as you explain the concepts, if you are conducting quantitative research, while you're explaining the concepts, you are meant to be hypothesizing the relationships between them. Because for a quantitative study, you will have hypotheses. So while you're explaining the relationships between the concepts and conceptualizing them, you need to be formulating your hypotheses as you go along. And then after you do that, you review the underpinning theories and then tell us which of the theories you are going to apply in testing the hypotheses that you have identified, right? Or in explaining the relationships between the variables in your hypotheses that you have posed. So after you do that, you come and present everything in a diagrammatic form in your conceptual framework, which you are going to use to address the research objectives and questions, right, based on the hypotheses that you have formulated. Now, it is important for us to note that apart from chapter 1, every other chapter in between chapter 1 and the last chapter begins with a chapter overview and a chapter summary. So the chapter overview from chapter 2 to chapter 5, assuming chapter 6 is your last chapter, tells us what you are going to cover in each of the sections in the chapter that you are on. And then the chapter summary tells us what you covered in the chapter once you are done writing it and what you are going to be focusing on in the upcoming chapter. So once you finish your literature review chapter, you put together your nice chapter summary, and then you move into the context of the study, where you tell us about the context in which you are conducting the study. If it is a particular organization, you have to tell us in depth about the organization and the industry that the organization belongs to, right? Sometimes you may even go ahead to cover the location, depending on how you are conducting the study and the context in which you are situating your study in, right? So whether it's a quantitative study or a qualitative study, you still need to tell us the context of the study so that we can contextualize, your arguments and the findings of your study. Very, very important, right? Then after you cover the context of the study, you move into your research methodology. Now, your research methodology is basically where you are telling us the process you are going to go through in designing your data collection process, analyzing the data that you gather, and how you are going to extract the results. So with research methodology, it usually begins with identifying your research philosophy, right? And the best model to use to help you through this process is what we refer to as the research onion, right? By Saunders et al. So Saunders et al. Used the research onion to explain the different parts of the research methodology. And like I said, whether you're writing long essay or thesis will determine how deep you go with explaining your research methodology. So you will notice that if you pick a PhD thesis or an MPhil thesis and you pick a long essay, the level of detail that they will go into talking about their philosophy, the methodological choices they are making, the research approach they are using, the strategies that they are using, and their data collection and analysis will not be as detailed as can be found in a thesis. Long essays would usually touch briefly on all of the sections and then tell us specifically what they are doing in their research. But the thesis will go into more detail, presenting explanations and justifications for the choices that they are making in terms of methodology. right? So every methodology chapter that you pick must give us a sense of all these different levels of the research onion. Otherwise, you are not explaining in depth enough how you went about designing your instruments, gathering your data, and analyzing it to get the insights that you are going to use to address the research objectives and questions that you have identified, right? So it is important for you to make sure that all these ingredients are present in your methodology if it is to be an acceptable methodology chapter, right? So once you go through all that and tell us about your philosophy, your research approach, your research strategy, the sample that you are using by telling us how you went about sampling those respondents, and then the data collection approach that you are using, how you are going to analyze the data, be it quantitative or qualitative, and then the ethical considerations. Ethics are very important. That is why when you are writing a thesis, it is a requirement for you to go for ethical clearance, at least at the PhD level, because you want to make sure that you are not violating any ethical rules in gathering data and analyzing it and using it to draw conclusions for your research. So once your methodology chapter is complete, you now move into your chapter 5, where you present the results from the analysis that you are conducting, and you discuss these results. Now, it is important for students to realize that when you are discussing the results from your study, you can't discuss them in isolation. You always have to link the results that you are discussing and the outcomes of your analysis with the discussions you did in your literature review. Remember that in your literature review, you talk about how this author said this and that author said that. So your findings are supposed to refer back to that literature review you did and tell us whether the findings you are having are agreeing with what these literature that you reviewed in your literature review are saying, or they are contradicting them. That is the only way we can be able to see that your contribution to existing knowledge is actually apparent, because you are directly telling us what the literature covered that your study is confirming and what the literature did not cover that your study is finding, thereby pointing us to the new things that you are introducing and the existing things that your study is helping us to confirm. Please, I hope we understand this.
Yes, please.
Good. So never discuss your results in isolation. Your discussion of your results and the output of your analysis must always be done hand in hand with the discussion you did in your literature review. That is the only way that we can be able to see that you are indeed contributing to knowledge. And we can see the significance of your study slowly materializing. And once you are able to do this, you can then move on to the last chapter where you are drawing your conclusions. And these conclusions are drawn based on each of the objectives you identified in the beginning of the long essay, telling us whether the objectives were addressed or not, and what that means by implication to research, practice, and policy, which will help us to be able to confirm whether the significance of the study that you told us in chapter 1 has indeed materialized. Please, I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
Good. So whatever implications you are discussing at the end in your conclusion should be telling us what you told us you were going to achieve in the significance in the chapter 1, and whether or not it has actually been able to be achieved. And that is why I said the research that you are doing is iterative, because you will keep going back and forth between the sections to make sure that all the sections are coherent. Because the long essay, like I always say, is one long story. So the parts have to be connected in order for the entire story to make sense. And once you complete the final chapter, you go ahead and produce your reference list, which will detail all the citations that you have used in your work. And this reference list, per University of Ghana standards, must strictly follow the APA referencing style. How many of us here are aware of the APA referencing style? And that it is a requirement for the University of Ghana.
All of us.
All of you.
All of us.
Hey,
All of us.
I have students long essay that say otherwise.
Hey.
Because students will send you long essay and their referencing is Harvard style.
Well, then they are in a different world, please.
They have Harvard style referencing, and they submit it for you to review, and you send them back to do referencing, and they are unhappy. Doc is wasting my time.
They are on University of Ghana. They are on their University of Ghana.
Hello, Doc.
Yes, Eunice.
Can you please elaborate or go over the conclusion part for me again, please?
Okay, so what I was basically saying in the conclusion is that you are summarizing the entire study and telling us whether the objectives you have identified in your chapter 1 have been achieved or not. So this is where you are stating the objectives you started with and the corresponding findings in your study that address each of the objectives, right? So here you are revisiting your research objectives and questions in the beginning and the framework that you designed based on those objectives and questions, and telling us how your findings address each one of them. And if your findings are addressing each one of them, then you should be able to tell us the implications that they have for research, practice, and policy, which you have outlined already again in the chapter 1 under significance of the study. So if in chapter 1, your significance is telling us that your study is contributing A and B to the literature, then the implication should tell us that indeed, based on so and so findings, your study is contributing A and B to the literature. And you do same for practice and policy where applicable. So Eunice, I hope that makes sense now.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Good. So after the references, yes, is that Ferdinand?
No, this is Ghazali.
Okay, Ghazali, go ahead. I thought we said we'll keep the questions and answers to the end. Though.
No, it's not a question I want to ask.
Okay.
It's just a proposal. I don't want to forget after the program.
Okay, Ghazali, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just a request that maybe if we can get the material after the whole lecture so that it will keep us. Yes.
Oh, you'll get it.
That's fine.
Yeah,
so from you or from the executives of GRASAC?
I will give it to the executives to share with you.
That's
but
fine.
you also
Thank
you can also reach out to me on email if they don't give it to you. But your GRASAC executives, they are top notch.
I'll even come to your office for it.
Yes, please. Thank
That's
you.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Samuel, is it a question?
Hello,
yes, please.
Please, I have a
Yes, it's a question. It's on the referencing style.
Yes.
Yeah, because you mentioned APA is the standard, but I also know that departments have their housing style. So, for example, in the religions department, it is Chicago Manual.
Okay.
So, in that case, and I know the PhD handbook gives room for the departments to go according to the house style from the department.
So, that's PhD. So, I'm speaking in very general terms.
Okay.
But like you said, when we come to specifics and we are breaking it down by specialization and even by department, the PhD handbook gives room for that. So Samuel, I hope you are okay.
Yes, I am. Thank you for the clarification.
Good. You're welcome.
Hello, Doc. Please, I also have a question.
Yes, Sandra.
Please, with the APA references style, which edition are we really supposed to use? Because recently
the most recent edition is the 7th edition.
7, okay.
That's what I know is out there that people are
so
using. But
someone
people still
who's about submitting her thesis said her supervisor returned her work because the supervisor said the new one is the 9th edition, and so she's supposed to use that.
Okay, there's a 9th edition. I'm not aware. But if there's a 9th edition, that's what the supervisor is saying, then you have to go with the supervisor's way. And that brings me to something I was going to say later. But since you've mentioned it, let me say it now.
Okay.
Please, I will encourage all of you to hold your supervisors in high esteem, regardless of how difficult you think they are, regardless of how complex and troublesome you think they are. Mainly because, one, without their say-so, you cannot proceed. I hope you are aware of that.
Yeah.
Okay, Doc, is APA the same as OSCOLA?
No, it's not the same.
I see. We are asked to go by OSCOLA.
Good. So like I said, there are some exceptions at the departmental level and at the school level, which are approved and allowed for in the handbook. Like our good gentleman just said, is it Sam? Yes, I think it was Sam who said that. So you have to be able to go with what your department is saying. But in absence of any specific directions and requirements given to you by your department or your school or your supervisor, you need to go with the general guidelines provided by the School of Graduate Studies. And they usually recommend the APA style. Please, I hope that makes sense now.
Yeah, it is.
Good.
Yeah, it does.
So back to what I was saying about the supervisor. You have to learn how to respect your supervisor's opinions and direction. Because if you do not follow their opinions and their direction, you cannot expect them to wholeheartedly support you and give you good input for your work. So please, there is always a way around working with your supervisor, no matter what your sentiments towards them are. You just need to have the right approach to dealing with whatever challenge you believe you are facing in engaging with them. And everything will pan out fine. So it's the same way our good lady was telling us that a supervisor returned the students' work saying that she should go and use the APA 9th edition. I know there would have been some murmuring in the background and some anger, but at the end of the day, this supervisor has good reason for insisting on this. And therefore, just give yourself some ample room to make time for these little side tracking things that will come in when you are doing the thesis. And I'll talk about that when we are nearing the end of the presentation regarding how you manage your time and schedule your time to be able to make room for certain deviations to the process that will appear, because they would usually come. Right?
Hello, Doc.
Yes.
Hello, Doc.
Yes,
please, before we proceed very further, can you please kindly touch on the chapter 3 once again, the context? I think I'm having some challenges there. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go back to that. Mohammed, is it a question?
No, please. I want, like, there have been so many interjections.
Yeah.
And I feel like the moderator or president is not doing his work. You can see that a lot of participants are unmuted.
Yeah.
People are just chipping in. I think it will be in order if we keep raising our hands instead of just the presenter is presenting, the gentleman will just keep just getting hello, Doc. It doesn't go well, please.
Yeah.
So the facilitator can. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mohammed. Ferdinand, over to you.
Doc, please, I really wanted to talk about that, but right from the onset of the presentation, you allowed every question to come in and you are responding to them. That's why I couldn't stop you from answering them. I wanted to address them. So I was even coming to put it in the chat that they should put it in the chat rather than interjecting you.
Yeah.
But
so please just type your questions in the chat so that Ferdinand can do his job effectively, okay? I'll be done very soon so that we can go ahead and do the question and answer. So let me finish quickly rather, and then we can address all your questions or address all your questions and answers. Okay. So in terms of the chapter 3, like our good friend said we should go over, it's basically about the context of the study. Where are you conducting the study? Usually when you are doing research, it is usually centered around a particular sample. Now that sample that you are studying them in relation to a particular phenomenon that is occurring in a given scenario. Now this scenario that it's occurring in maybe a particular geographic location, a particular industry, a particular organization, a particular group, right? Or a particular population. So you have to be able to tell us in-depth information about this population, this industry, this location, this group, to help us to be able to understand how you are conducting the study and some of the ultimate findings that you will have by the time you finish collecting and analyzing data. Because context sometimes makes a big difference between how you interpret certain kinds of findings, as opposed to how you would have interpreted it if it was being found in another context, right? So it is important for us to be able to state the context of the study. And I'll give you a prime example. When I was doing my PhD, I was doing it on online relationship marketing and looking at how technology is used in relationship marketing in banking. Now, in other parts of the developed world, like Europe and the United States, online relationship marketing was thriving because of the fact that they were used to doing business without doing it face-to-face, by using technology as a medium, right? So culturally, they were accustomed to and comfortable with doing business and transactions, particularly financial transactions, using faceless mediums, right? But in our context in Ghana here, when it comes to things related to money and exchanging money and transactions, culturally, people will prefer to do it in a face-to-face mode. True or false?
Very true.
Good. So you realize when you follow the trend of how we began to use technology as a key part of our financial system in Ghana here, it took a lot of effort and convincing and sometimes hardcore tactics to be able to push Ghanaian consumers to become comfortable with using electronic media for conducting financial transactions. So in that case, the context makes the whole difference, given that in our context, during the time I was doing my PhD, technology was still in its nascent stages. People were not yet comfortable with using faceless mediums to engage in transactions, let alone financial transactions, right? However, if you compare it to the context in countries like Europe and the United States, they were comfortable with it, and therefore introducing concepts like online relationship marketing in their domains was easier to do and more beneficial, right? So this is an example of how context can make the difference in terms of findings and help you to clarify why you get some of the outcomes that you get. Okay, so the context of the study is very important. So in essence, that is the set of phases of the research process for a long essay, right? Now, sometimes when you are doing qualitative research, you can collapse the context of the study into the research methodology chapter, and then you discuss both of them together. So sometimes you will see that some of the long essays have 5 chapters, especially the qualitative ones, right? But for quantitative ones, they usually need to have the 6 because the context chapter has to be separated from the methodology chapter and the analysis chapter. Okay, good. So after you finish your references, you introduce your appendices, which are usually artifacts that you cannot put in the work that you want to add to enhance your discussion and the explanations that you have done in your work. And the main appendix that you usually include as part of your work is the data collection instruments that you used. So if it was an interview guide or a questionnaire of some sort, you will put it in the appendices, right? So that and refer to it in the work, so that whoever is interested in looking at it into more detail can go to the appendices and access it to look at it. Okay, good. Now, like I said, unlike the long essay, the thesis goes into more detail and depth, right? So everything that we discussed, the thesis would usually expand upon it, such that in the long essay, we saw that the literature review chapter usually includes the theoretical foundations of the work, where for a long essay, the theories are discussed within the literature review, and the emergence theory that will be used for the research is also shown in the literature review. However, for a thesis, be it an MPhil or PhD thesis, the theoretical foundation chapter is separated from the literature review chapter, such that you have a whole chapter dedicated to discussing the numerous theories that you identified that have been used to conduct research in your area, and then the one that you ultimately ended up choosing for your work, which then leads into the design of the conceptual framework for your work that you are going to use to address your research objectives and questions. So here, the theoretical foundations are separated from the literature review and stand alone as their own chapter, right? However, the research methodology chapter stays the same on its own, right? And then you can have an additional context chapter if you have a specific context to discuss and you're doing a quantitative study. Like I said, sometimes some people for their qualitative studies will collapse the context into their research methodology. But generally, you will separate it from your research methodology and add it as a separate chapter. And then you will discuss your findings separately from the analysis that you did and your results. So ultimately, if you were doing a quantitative study, you will end up with 9 chapters, because then you will have the introduction chapter, the literature review chapter, the theoretical foundations and conceptual framework chapter, your context of the study, which could you come before the literature review and theoretical foundations or after. And then you have your research methodology, and then you have the data analysis that you did and the results, and then a whole chapter dedicated to the discussion of your findings, where you are comparing what you found to the literature that you discussed in your literature review, like we said when we were talking about the long essay. And then you move on to your conclusion chapter, where you are revisiting your research objectives and questions and whether or not they have been addressed by your findings, and then ultimately presenting the implications of your study, and then discussing your limitations and future research directions, if any. Then you conclude with your references, which is APA style, or the department required or school required specific style that you are supposed to use for completing your work, if any. If not, then you revert to the graduate school standard, which is the APA style. And then you present your appendices, right? So those are the phases of the research process for the long essay and the thesis. Now, in terms of the outline of the preliminary pages and the chapter 1, like I said, there is an order in which the preliminary pages must be presented per graduate school standard. And it begins first with your cover page, where you tell us the name of your department, your topic, your name and index number, the declaration, right, of the what your thesis is contributing to in terms of your area of specialization. And then you tell us the month and the year. That's on the cover page. Then you have a title page, right, where it is like a repetition of what is on the cover page, but is being presented again for the purposes of those who want to print their work. Then we have the declaration. And this is where you are declaring that the work that you have done is yours and is not copied from any other source. Now, this is where a lot of students make a mistake. Students have been reverting back to the old format that was being used by the university before this new format was introduced. In the old format, the declaration was split into 2 parts, where you have a declaration page and a certification page, right? So when we present the declaration page, we separate the declaration that we are making from the certification page. And the declaration page is signed only by the students, and then the certification page is signed by the supervisors. However, with the new graduate school outline, the declaration and the certification are merged together, such that on the declaration page, you present your declaration statement where you certify that the work is yours, it is not copied from anywhere, you've not submitted it to any other school for a qualification. And then the student signs, and then the supervisors of the student also sign successively under. So there is no certification page, right? It's just the declaration page. And then after that, we have the abstract, and then the dedication, if you have anybody you want to dedicate your work to, which is not compulsory to have. And then acknowledgements, where you would usually thank people like your supervisors and your friends and your colleagues and everybody who played a role in helping make the process a smooth one for you. And then we can talk about the table of contents, which gives us a snapshot of everything in your thesis or long essay document and where they can be found. And then that is followed by the list of figures and then the list of tables, if any. Right? So if you do not have any figures in your table, in your research work, that you have labeled and have to indicate, you do not present a list of figures page, right? Likewise, the list of tables. They basically show us in chronological order all the tables that you have in your work and the pages on which these can be found. So this is the order in which preliminary pages must be presented. But more often than not, you'll find students mixing things up. right? Some students will come and put the abstract after the table of contents. Others will come and put the acknowledgements before the declaration, and so on and so forth. You have to familiarize yourself with the requirements so that you can make sure that you satisfy all of them. Otherwise, your work will keep going back and forth for trivial things that you could have easily addressed before submitting the work in the first place. Good. So once you're done with the preliminary pages, you move into the chapter 1, which, like we said, has to have certain key characteristics in order to provide a solid foundation for your research. And that is having the research background, which we have talked about, the research problem, which we are going to go into more detail on, and then the research purpose, which is usually 3 or 4 lines, sometimes 2 lines, that tell us the specific purpose of your study in one statement or 2. And then the research objectives and the research questions, which are the question form of your objectives. And then the research significance, which research should be in terms of significance to existing knowledge, significance to practice, and significance to policy. And then we have the synopsis of chapters, or the chapter organization, or the organization of the study, whichever way you choose to refer to it. Good. So in that case, when you are writing a compelling problem statement, what does it entail? The word compelling here is being used because your problem statement has to be such that it is pointing to something new that we do not necessarily know about already in the literature that is worth exploring, that we have to pay attention to. So it is not enough to just pick a study that has already been done and replicate it just because you like it and you think it is something that you can easily do and avoid the stress of having to go through hoops completing the long essay or thesis. It will not help you. You need to write a compelling problem statement because that is going to be the basis for the literature review of your study, the basis upon which you develop your research objectives, the basis upon which you develop the significance of your study, and the basis upon which you go ahead and develop your hypotheses for data collection and analysis. Right? If it is a qualitative study, it's going to be the basis upon which you go into the field to explore. So writing a compelling problem statement is very important because without that, you basically have no foundation for your research, which will be a wasted effort because every research, whether long essay or thesis, has to be based upon a solid gap in existing knowledge or gap in existing literature that you have identified that needs to be filled. Good. So when we talk of a problem statement, what is it? It captures, like I said, an existing knowledge gap in the area that you want to study. So once you identify this gap, you are basically telling us that your study, by the time it is concluded, is going to help us to bridge this gap using the outcomes or the results of your study based on the data that you are going to collect and how you are going to analyze it. So usually when people develop a problem statement, you see that it highlights something new or something surprising in the literature that we were not aware of prior, or goes ahead to probe certain initial findings that they believe can be improved upon or that they believe have changed based on shifts in phenomenon or specific ways that the phenomenon that they are studying has changed over the period that that study has been in existence, and therefore require further investigation in order to be able to establish a proper research problem for the research that they are going to conduct. So your problem statement cannot just summarize what is already there and leave it at that. No, it has to be able to tell us what is already there, what is missing from what is already there, and how your study is going to help us to find that which is missing, right? In that regard, the specific type of problem that you choose to address will depend on the type of research that you want to do and the gap that you believe you have to pursue. Because by the time you finish writing your problem statement, you would have conducted an extensive literature review, which would have helped you identify several gaps, not just one. So you will have to narrow down and decide which of those gaps your study is going to address, because your study cannot address each and every one of them. So in addressing those gaps, you will be able to clearly tell us the purpose of your study and develop specific research objectives that will help us know how you are going to address the gaps that you have indicated that you will be addressing. So in essence, what I just said means that you cannot write a good or compelling problem statement if you have not done an extensive literature review. And that is another problem I have with master's students. I saw someone in the chat mentioning something about doing a literature review and having limited literature, like 2 or 3 articles. For me, that is long essay and thesis suicide. As soon as I see something like that, the work is coming back to you with speed, because you cannot say you have developed a problem statement and all I can see are 2 or 3 literature sources that you keep referring to in succession. It means that you do not have a full grasp of the issues in the area to tell us a substantive enough problem that your research is going to address. So to be able to write a compelling problem statement, you have to have a good grasp of the literature, right? So to do this, you generally have to start with the area of interest that you have. And this is where I tend to discourage students from going into the thesis writing process with a specific topic in mind. Sometimes you meet students for the first time and they have already formulated their whole topic with all the dimensions set in place without even probing the literature to see if the dimensions they have identified in the topic are still relevant or worth pursuing. So I would usually encourage students to start with an area of interest and then go deep into the literature in that area of interest to see the contemporary issues that are being discussed in that area in order to identify what is of interest to them. And once they identify what is of interest to them, they have to go specifically into looking at what we know about that area of interest that they have identified, which they want to focus their research on. So this will involve downloading literature or articles specifically in that issue you saw under the area of interest that you started with, that you want to pursue in your long essay or thesis. And once you have a firm grasp of what we know about that issue in the area, you now go into looking at what we do not know, which are basically the gaps in the literature. So that is what you will be able to establish by engaging in what we refer to as a synthesis of literature, where you are reading through the literature to see people who share similar ideas. By people, I mean scholars, researchers who are writing these articles, who share similar ideas, others who contradict these ideas and why they contradict them, to be able to see where gaps occur in their arguments, to be able to establish what you want to focus on in your study. So by the time you finish this process, you would have identified a number of gaps, which will tell us several things that we do not know when it comes to the issue that is of interest to you in the area that you started with. And then you now, as a researcher, have to make the expert decision of which of the gaps you are going to pursue in order to conduct your research on. And that is what gives us your research purpose. So without doing a thorough literature review to establish what we know, what we do not know, and helping you to zero in on what we do not know and which of those things that we do not know you want to focus on, you will not be able to tell us clearly what your research purpose is, which will be a very weak foundation for a thesis or long essay. So in essence, writing a compelling statement requires you to do a thorough literature review and also synthesize the literature that you identify during the literature review process very well, such that you can be able to establish a solid foundation in terms of the gaps in the literature that you want to focus on, which you will later extend and expand into your literature review chapter and your theoretical foundations. So generally, the statement of the problem section or the problem statement section in your long essay or thesis, depending on which one you are writing, could be about averagely a page if it's a long essay, right? But for a thesis, it could be on average 2 pages or more. Sometimes you see a PhD thesis based on how they want to address the research problem could go on and on for about 4 or 5 pages, just establishing the research problem, because they have to provide a solid alibi from the literature for why they arrived at that issue as a problem and why they have chosen to address it in the manner that they are choosing to. Right? So when we talk of literature synthesis, which I said without, you cannot be able to do a good problem statement, you are basically looking at all the different sources that you are identifying in your literature review. And these sources, might I add, must be contemporary, right? Except in cases where you cannot be able to find adequate literature that is contemporary enough to help you address the issues that you are looking into. But apart from that, you have to make sure that you get contemporary literature that you will summarize and paraphrase in order to be able to determine the ideas that have been put forth by scholars around the theme or the issue that is of interest to you. And in summarizing and paraphrasing all this information you are consuming, you are basically looking out for points where the scholars agree on specific things and points where they disagree or where their ideas contrast. And then you are introducing your voice by critically assessing these points of disagreement and agreement and situating it in the context of the issue that you are addressing to tell us what problem your thesis or long essay is going to address. So it is not enough to just summarize all the papers that agree in their findings and summarize all the papers that disagree in their findings and tell us. No. You also have to add your voice into it to tell us what you think these points of agreement and disagreement mean for the issue that you are studying and how it constitutes a problem that your research is going to address. So in that regard, when you are doing your literature synthesis, you are basically looking at the places where the literature overlaps and where they contrast, and where you can be able to introduce new ideas to try and address the problems that you have identified in terms of this overlapping and contrasting arguments relating to the issue or the theme that you are trying to focus on. So by the time you finish, you would have identified a lot of gaps. And based on research methodology, we know that when we are doing research, there are 3 main gaps that we usually identify and work with. Sometimes there's a 4th that is added, but it is weaker compared to the initial 3, right? So can someone tell us what these gaps are? Or can some people help us with these gaps? There are 4 main types of gaps you can identify in the literature.
Yes, Doc.
Godwin, you have to raise your hand.
Hello?
Okay, Mohammed's hand is raised. So Mohammed, give us the first one.
Please, we can identify an issue gap.
Issue gaps, very, very important, because without having an issue gap, there's no basis or premises for your work at all. So issue gaps are the number 1 and most important gap. Grace, give us a second one.
Contextual gap.
Contextual gap, but it is the weakest of the 3.
Theoretical gap.
Theoretical gap as well, right? So in terms of the theoretical gap is the second strongest, which when combined with an issue gap is very powerful. Contextual gaps are the weakest. So usually we have contextual gaps in addition to the 3 initial ones, right? Silas, what's the third one?
Methodological gap.
Methodological gap. So usually strong problem statements that are identifying strong gaps will usually give us a strong issue and theoretical gap, or a strong issue, theoretical and methodological gap, or a strong issue, theoretical and contextual gap, or any combination of these 4, right? But sometimes you would notice that a study will just give you the first 2, which is issue and theory, which is very fine because those 2 are the strongest. Sometimes the person will combine an issue and a methodological gap, which is again very good because methodology is one of the strong gaps. But no matter what you do, make sure that you always have a good issue gap and combine that with any of the other 3 and your problem statement will be solid, right? So when you're reviewing the literature and looking at where they overlap and where they contrast, You are looking specifically in terms of the issues that have been discussed, the theories that have been used, the methodologies that have been applied, and the contexts in which these studies have been done. So when you are doing this and adding your own ideas and adding your own thoughts in terms of why you think these overlapping and contrasting ideas are taking place, then your work is taking shape and you are beginning to own it. So we can't say you own the work if we cannot see your ideas in the discussion. If you are basically presenting to us what is there and what is not there, what is overlapping and what is contrasting by way of summary and discussion, you are basically not putting yourself in the work. You're not telling us anything. You're just giving us reported speech. But by adding your own ideas and your thoughts in terms of how these issues are emerging and how you think they can be addressed, then you are putting yourself in the work and creating a unique issue that your research work is going to address. Okay, so that is essentially what literature synthesis is about. So let me give you a simple example of synthesis of literature that combines the three things that we talked about in terms of where the literature overlaps, where they agree, where they contrast, and then the ideas of the researcher coming together to create a strong problem. So this is an extract from the problem statement from my PhD, right? And it reads, the three dimensions of customer commitment, normative, affective, and continuance, have often been overlooked in customer relationship studies. Now you will see that this statement alone combines two things, where the literature contrasts and the ideas of the researcher. Because here, I'm basically stating that in reading through the literature, I saw that researchers have ignored the individual dimensions, and basically because they have ignored it, in my opinion, there is the need for it to be looked into. So that means that in the papers that I read, I saw researchers looking at one or two or either of the three rather than combining all the three of them, which I believe constitutes an oversight on their behalf. Right? And then I go on further to explain with my own ideas that they have often been lumped up together based on what I saw in the literature. So it means that based on what I saw in the literature, the researchers who were doing the research were basically putting all of them together as one unidimensional construct, rather than breaking it down into the different components, which some other researchers have also done. So here I'm talking about what I saw in terms of where the literature is overlapping and where the literature is contrasting. Please, I hope you are with me.
Yes, please.
Good. So here, I'm basically not just reporting what is there, but I'm reporting and doing my own commentary and adding my own perspectives. That is how you make the work yours. That is why for a PhD, even though you pass the written part, we still insist you do a viva because we want to be able to see if you are in the work. So this is a typical example of how you are situating your own ideas and thoughts to extract a problem based on the gaps you are identifying from the literature where it overlaps and contrasts, right? And then it goes on to say that affective commitment comes about as a result of the emotional connection between exchange parties, while normative commitment is generated from the customer's sense of moral obligation towards a particular organization. And then calculative commitment is brought about by the presence of sunken and switching costs. So here, based on everything that I read, I'm providing a general explanation of the concepts that I am talking about. So here I'm paraphrasing and summarizing based on all the literature that I read and how they explained these concepts that I am talking about. Again, putting myself in the work and the discussion. So how I've explained these concepts is how I'm going to carry them to my literature review chapter to expand the explanation and justify why I'm approaching it from this operationalization and how it is going to play out in my data collection and analysis. Right? So in that case, you see that without knowing in depth what the literature says about your issue and what is not captured about your issue in the literature, There is no way you can do this juxtaposition that I have just done by looking at where the literature overlaps, where it contrasts, and how your ideas can be able to look at these gaps and frame them in a way that will bring forth the research problem that you intend to address. Okay, so the literature review is very important and you cannot escape it. And with that, we move into the discussion on literature review, where a literature review is basically analyzing existing scholarly literature and research on a specific topic. And you are analyzing this research simply to be able to know the current knowledge in that area or issue that you are focused on, and the gaps and research trends that have emerged in that area. So like I said, and I will keep on saying, without knowing what is written in the area, without having knowledge of the literature in the area, you cannot be able to tell us where the gaps are or where the research trends are. And if you can't do that, then it means you can't create a good enough research problem for your study to address. Now, in that regard, when you are conducting a literature review, there are three main kinds of literature review that people normally do. Okay, we have the narrative review, which is a descriptive, subjective summary of the literature on a specific topic, which you will find a lot of the long essay students doing. Because a lot of depth is not required for their work, they tend to be able to get away with conducting a narrative review. But it comes with its shortcomings, because it means that usually when you are reading their research problem, you will see that it has a lot of gaps and weaknesses because they have not done enough to review adequately the literature in the area to establish a solid enough problem, right? But to the contrary, the systematic review, which is a more structured and rigorous examination of the literature, is more in-depth and therefore helps us to be able to establish stronger gaps in literature as they relate to the issues addressed, the theories covered, the methodologies used, and the context in which they were studied. So you will normally find MPhil and PhD thesis writing students using the systematic review approach, because that is the only way it can help them to understand the body of knowledge in the area that they are studying to a large extent, and the gaps and trends that exist in that area. Now, the term fraud of literature review is not very common among students, right? It's usually common among more established researchers who have mastered the art of harvesting and combining data from multiple studies and using statistical methods to analyze the data and then developing conclusions from which they produce manuscripts, right? So the meta-analysis is reserved for more experienced researchers who have a skill set in that area. But for student work, long essay and thesis, they normally engage in narrative reviews and systematic reviews, of which I always encourage my students to go for a systematic review, because that is the only way they can establish strong enough gaps and have a good grasp of the knowledge in the area in order to come up with a good research problem to base their long essay or thesis on, right? So like I said, the narrative review is not nearly as robust as the systematic review, right? Because it is a selective review of literature, meaning that the end product may not necessarily help you cover enough of the literature to give you a good idea of the knowledge that exists in the area. And because it does not follow strict systematic methods, it is very difficult for you to be able to justify and systematically follow the issues that are emerging and the gaps that you're identifying, and why you are going to pick on specific gaps to pursue for your own research, which the systematic review will help you to be able to do. So like I said, I'll always encourage my students, regardless of level, whether long essay or thesis, to always begin with a systematic review. That way, you have a good grasp of the literature, you know the issues that have been addressed, you know where there have been overlaps and contrasts, and you know the gaps and trends that exist to be able to establish a solid enough research problem for your long essay or thesis, depending on the one that you are writing, right? So in that case, you cannot treat the literature review process haphazardly, because it becomes the foundation upon which you build the problem statement, which you are going to ultimately expand into your entire literature review chapter and use that to develop your research objectives and questions with which you are going to build your framework, develop your data collection instrument, collect data, and analyze in order to establish findings for your work, right? So the literature review is very important. And without it, I doubt you will be able to establish a solid enough or compelling research problem to base your entire long essay or thesis on, right? So in the end, generally, it is not an easy process. It is painstaking. It takes a lot of effort. But there are two tips that I will always encourage you to use. The first one is to read and write every day. So every day, try as much as possible to read at least one article. For the purposes of long essay, I always say before you can establish a good enough problem statement, you should have read up to 20 articles, up to 50 if you can. For MPhil and PhD, I always say 100 papers and above. That way, you know that you have a fair idea of the issues that have been addressed in the area that you are studying, and you can easily identify the gaps and the trends. Now, you cannot do it all in one sitting. You have to do it over a period of time. And that is why it is advisable to read and write every day. So that on the good days when you are inspired, you can write a lot. And on the days when you don't feel too good, at least you will write 1 line or 2 lines. Or at least you'll be forced to sit down and think about what to write, which will help you to be able to get several steps closer to completing the thesis writing or long essay writing process, right? And the second tip is to be able to create a time plan and schedule buffers in case something goes wrong. Like I said, sometimes you are reviewing literature and you would have, up until the points that you were completing the literature review, been set on what gaps you want to pursue. But by the time you finish the literature review, you may have unearthed a certain number of papers that will completely change your mindset and change the direction of your work. If you do not plan and put in place adequate measures and buffers to help you to make up for the loss of time that that setback will pose, it means that you will be behind time. And in schools like the University of Ghana, where there's a set schedule for which you have to start and finish your thesis, it means that you will end up missing a deadline and going into extension, which will cost you money. How many of us here are aware of the submission windows for MPhil and PhD thesis and MBA thesis? MBA, MA, MFA. What are the graduate school windows for thesis submission or long essay submission? What are the windows? Are you telling me nobody here knows the submission windows?
Yes, please, sir.
You don't know them. Hey, Grasag. Grasag, are you there? Sadiq. Sadiq, your people don't know the windows, so that's a problem. That's a serious problem.
December 2023.
Letitia, are you sure? Are you sure?
15th December.
Are you sure?
That is the extension.
Thank you.
15th December.
Please, that's the extension. Listen, they're telling you some serious facts. That's the extension. There's a submission window which you have elapsed. And I believe Grasag went to beg. So they have given you up to 15 December. There are submission windows. And you miss these windows and you go into extension. There's a period of extension that is free of charge. But then after a certain period, you have to pay up to a certain percentage of your school fees. So you have to know these timings and deadlines so that when you are working, you work backwards and say, okay, even if it takes my supervisor 3 months to read my work, if I'm able to finish at this time, it can take him 3 months and I'll still make the deadline. These are things you should be thinking about. Or based on the timelines, I have to start working on these chapters at this point so that even if I'm set back by 2 months in data collection and analysis and back and forth, at least I'll make the window. These are things you should be able to learn. Otherwise, you'll be in trouble. Right? So on that note, let me end the submission here. And let's take our questions and answers. Please, I hope you understood everything I said up until this point.
Yes, Doc.
Yes, Doc.
So let's move into our question and answer session. Let me go straight to the chat. It seems we have a lot of submissions in the chat. Let me take it from Silas. Okay, so Silas in the chat asked right before we close the questions and answers that some MPhil theses are done in 5 chapters. How different is that from a 6-chapter structure? I believe I explained this. Sometimes some people will collapse the contextual chapter and merge it with the methodology chapter, right? Others will also collapse the theoretical foundations and merge it with the literature review chapter. But ideally, for an MPhil thesis, you should have a separate context chapter, especially if the work is quantitative, and have a separate chapter for your theoretical foundations, right? As well as separating the discussion of your results from the data analysis and results chapter. So in that case, some may end up with 7 chapters, right? Some 8, depending on how they are structuring it. But then again, it falls down to who your supervisor is and what they want you to include and what they don't want you to include, which chapters they want you to merge and which ones they want you to separate, right? Like I said, the buck stops with your supervisor and what is acceptable within the rules. So if your supervisor is asking you to do something, check the handbook and see if it is within the rules. If it is not, humbly bring it up with your supervisor and draw their attention to it. And then they'll help you think through a solution. So Silas, I hope that one helps. Emmanuel Ofori says it's going to be repeated or recorded, posted on this platform. Okay, so this is in relation to the recording. Okay, so Godwin says with the problem statement, having formulated the problem clearly and how the researcher intends to solve the problem through the research, is it mandatory to also show gaps in literature by discussing previous works? Yes. How did you arrive by the problem you formulated if you do not show us the gaps in the literature? So for the problem statement, you do not discuss all the gaps, but you need to discuss a few to let us know how you arrived at the problem that you are telling us about. Otherwise, we will assume that you just dreamt it from thin air. Please, I hope that makes sense. Please, does that make sense?
Doc.
Good.
Yes,
so you cannot just jump and say, this is my research problem. No, you have to give us a sense of how you arrived at that research problem by discussing a few of the studies that overlapped in their discussions, a few of the studies that contradicted, and how your ideas on those overlaps and contradictions led you to that research problem. Otherwise, it like you just manufactured it, which is unacceptable, especially if you are doing a thesis at the MPhil and PhD level.
I'm grateful, Doc.
You're welcome, Godwin. Okay. Divine says, if your study has very few literature, let's say 2, because there are not many studies that have been done on that particular topic, how do you review literature and how do you link your results with the reviewed literature? Divine, I put it to you that this literature you are saying that is only 2 is a gross understatement. You are really overreacting, Divine, because there is no area that you only find 2 papers. 2. 1. Hey, Divine, this is serious. 2. Oh, nah. Then you didn't search anywhere. In fact, you didn't do anything. Even a simple Google Scholar search on the topic will bring you both scholarly and non-scholarly materials from magazines, from student databases, student thesis and all that. So you can't say it's only 2. Hey, Divine. Nah. You will definitely find enough to do a literature review that can help you generate gaps. Otherwise, then it means the topic that you are focusing on is a problematic topic and you have to revisit it. Okay. Oh, it seems Dr. Prince Kodria was here with us. I don't know if he's still here. Doc, if you are still here, shout out to you. He was advising us to ask participants to raise their hands when they have questions. And I believe now we are doing that. So thank you very much, Doc, for the suggestion. We are most grateful. Please, that's one of my senior colleagues from the Department of Marketing and Entrepreneurship. Yeah, we are honored to have you here with us.
Yeah, good work done. Good work done. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Doc.
Nice. Bye.
Yes, Doc. Okay, so we continue. The next question says, is Divine again. Divine says, in literature review, is there a year limit for the literature that needs to be reviewed? Okay, So here, when it comes to literature review, in order to keep the ideas fresh and to make sure that the gaps that you are identifying that you are going to base your research on are not gaps that have already been addressed by some researchers in the past, we like to keep the literature that you review to at most the last 5 years. So it makes the ideas fresh and contemporary, because within the last 5 years, even if there have been some researchers who have also addressed the problem you are trying to address, they may not have covered it extensively. So keeping it at the last 5 years means that you will have fresh ideas, and then you will get enough literature to be able to review, to identify the trends, and then get the relevant gaps that you can use to build a strong research problem. So Divine, I hope that is answering your question. Okay, we'll come back to the chats. There are some hands up. Let's address them. Anne Chifa, please go ahead.
Hello.
Yes, Anne, we can hear you.
Hello. Please,
Anne,
can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Nobody's saying anything.
Oh, Anne, we can hear you. It seems you can't hear us.
Hello?
Anne, we can hear you.
Hello?
Anne, if you can't hear us, kindly type your question in the chat and then we'll address it.
Okay, I can hear you.
Okay, then go ahead.
Please, I would like to know if the articles we have to read, we'll be reading everything from the beginning to the recommendations or conclusions.
Hey, Anne, I can't tell you how many times I've got this question because students don't want to sit down and read.
Yes, it's a lot of work.
Okay, so generally, when you are looking for literature, for example, to include in your literature review, the first thing you do is to read the abstract so that you can be able to tell whether the article will be relevant to your research issue that you want to address or not. So that's the first one.
Please, can you come again?
Please, can everyone hear me? Apart from Anne.
I can hear you.
Yes, please, we can.
Yes,
Okay.
I can hear you clearly.
Good. So you first start with the abstract because the abstract will give you a general idea of what the article is about. So after you read the abstract, if it doesn't make sense, you toss that article and move on to the next. But if you read the abstract and it makes sense, then you now have to go into their introduction, where they will usually give you a background and establish the research problem.
Okay.
So that will give you a sense of what the paper is about and the issues that they are addressing. And then another important section you can read is the methodology, because then it will tell you how they address the research problem they identified in the introduction. And then after the methodology, you read the findings. Then if the findings are that relevant and you want to go further, then you read the implications of the study. So you do not have to read everything before you know whether the paper will be relevant to your work or not. By the time you finish reading the abstract and the introduction, you will know whether the paper is addressing what you want to address or not. Sometimes a shortcut you can use if the study is quantitative, for example, and has a framework, is to go straight to the framework and see if the variables in the framework are the variables that you are considering as part of your work. If the variables you are interested in are not in the framework, you just throw the paper somewhere and move on to the next.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Anne. Please, I hope that makes sense to everybody.
Yes. Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, it does.
All right. Hassan, I go ahead, and then we'll go back to the chat.
Okay. All right, Dr. Sheena, it's still on the gaps.
Yeah.
Okay. Remember you made mention of issue gaps, theoretical gaps, and then conceptual gaps. Yes. Now, all these three, in developing your problem statement, do you necessarily have to get all three gaps captured?
No.
I want to find out whether you have to get all three gaps captured in your problem statement, in developing your problem statement.
No, you will not always have all three. But you need to have at least two.
Okay, doctor.
And there's one that you can't do without, which is an issue gap.
Yeah, sure.
Because without an issue gap, there's no basis for the research at all. Okay. So you need an issue gap plus another one or two. So maybe issue plus theory, or issue plus methodology, or issue plus context, or issue plus theory and context, issue plus methodology and context, in that order. But you need at all times to have an issue gap, and then you can add on one of the other three or two of the other three based on the gaps you identify in the literature.
Okay, doctor. Thank you.
You're welcome, Hasinai. Okay, Kazali, please go ahead.
Doctor, thank you very much for the presentation.
You're welcome.
We are so much grateful. Yeah. I'm asking this question from a background that maybe some of us are in the languages.
Mm-hmm.
And regarding the languages, you understand the dynamics. So,
yeah.
With all these that are presented, are they going to be general for all of us, or for the languages there will be a big difference?
Okay.
In the procedures and in the processes?
So these are very general, right? So most of the researchers in the humanities use this format in preparing their thesis and long essays.
That's okay.
But like I mentioned earlier, there are some specifics that relate specifically depending on the department that you are coming from or the school that you are coming from. So usually I encourage my students to go back to the archives and pull the work of students who have graduated from the department and look at the structure of and processes of their thesis. What are the sections that they have? How many chapters do they have? How did they structure it from cover page to cover page? And model your work after it.
That's okay.
Are you with me, Ghazali?
I'm with you, doctor.
Good. Because without that, you will not be able to know the best practice in your department or your unit.
It's true.
And even with this one, it's very general. You go from department, sometimes even in the business school, depending on the department you are in, OMIS or marketing, the structure may be slightly different. In marketing, for instance, I know the MPhils are required to put their overview chapter after the chapter 1, before the literature review. But it's not like that in other departments. So the best thing you have to do is to combine the general guidelines with the best practices in your department, so that you can put together a work that you know will be acceptable, that you can pass and pass well with. So Ghazali, I hope that answers your question.
You did very well. But Doc, I will seek for audience tomorrow. I'll be coming to meet my supervisor. Probably I will pass by your office.
Yes, just send me an email and let's continue the conversation.
That's fine, but I don't have your email details.
Please, I'll put it in the chat.
That's fine. Thank you.
You're welcome, sir. Okay, so let's continue. So Emmanuel Ofori says, my supervisor says there's no such thing like timelines. What does he mean? Your supervisor is trying to tell you that he doesn't work according to your timeline. Is Emmanuel Ofori still here? Emmanuel? Emmanuel, you can't put your supervisor on a timeline. The timeline is for you.
Yes, that's what he says. I was asking for a timeline, maybe chapter 1 or proposal.
You can't put him on timeline.
And he responded that way.
Yes, because you can't put him on a timeline. He's your supervisor. You are the one supposed to work with the timeline. So you should be able to say that I'm preparing my chapter 1. Between the time I submit to my supervisor and I get feedback, even if it takes 3 months, I should be able to work it such that after the 3 months when I receive it, I have enough time to work on it and prepare the other chapters to submit to him to be able to get feedback and finish my work on time. So you can't develop a timeline for your supervisor. No. The timeline is for you. That's why my final point was to be able to plan and create a buffer in your schedule in case there are any delays or setbacks. Because supervisors are very busy people. Aside supervising students, which they do a lot of, they also have teaching. And then they have other administrative duties. They do committee work, they do external community work. So they do a lot of things. So you can't say that you are putting them on a timeline and requiring them to do specific things for you at specific time. It's just not possible. What you can do is to create a timeline for yourself and put buffers in there in case they delay in getting back to you with comments. so that you can make sure that even if they delay, you are still in time towards completing your work. Right? So your supervisor was not just being mean, he was just giving you a simple answer.
Okay. Noted. Well, thank you.
Good. Okay. Ghazali says I should tell him the submission windows. Grasag, please, this is a call to action. At the beginning of every semester, please create an infographic or something and circulate it with the submission windows on it for all the students. Grasag executives, are you hearing me?
Yes, madam, please, it's noted.
Very, very important. So that they cannot say that you did not tell them. And then it will help solve the problem of you people always having to go and beg for extension. Because then you can say that you told them and you reminded them. So it will be top of their mind. So if it is an infographic or some kind of flyer, definitely they'll download it and have it on their phones. They'll have it in their computers. So it will be a constant reminder that this deadline is approaching and they'll be working towards it. Okay, so Ghazali, Grasag will do their work and share information about the deadlines with you.
Thank you very much, Doc.
You're welcome, sir. Okay, next, Portia is also asking about the recording. The recording will be shared. Hard copy of the handbook. Ghazali, there are no hard copies of the handbook as at now, but they are available to download on the School of Graduate Studies website. So when you go to the School of Graduate Studies website, you can download the Master's Handbook and the PhD Handbook. So kindly check there for it. Seth Kunta says, please, in the unlikely event that the supervisor doesn't pick your calls and not also respond to messages, what do you do? Seth, what messages did you send? Was it WhatsApp message? Please, I need you to clarify. Was it a WhatsApp message? Because that changes a lot. Phone calls, lecturers and supervisors are not obliged to pick students' phone calls. I personally do not like engaging with students on phone calls because once you have a phone conversation with a student, whatever discussion you had is gone. If a misunderstanding occurs or a miscommunication occurs, it's your word against theirs. And there is no record to show the conversation that actually took place and what ensued in that conversation. So most lecturers will avoid having phone call conversations with students, especially over official matters like supervision. Again, other lecturers also do not like WhatsApp at all because in the event of any issue, WhatsApp messages, in my opinion, are not submissible as evidence in the court of law in Ghana. But if it is through an email, emails are an official channel of communication. So if your lecturer is not picking your calls or responding to your WhatsApp messages, what you can do is to send them an official email detailing what you require from them. And then if they do not respond within a certain period, say 2 weeks, then you send a follow-up. And then if after that follow-up and the third follow-up, you do not get a response, then you can go to your department and perhaps see your head of department with the information you have and ask them to help you to reach your supervisor. But until you have done what I just mentioned, which is the right way to approach it, you cannot say that your supervisor is not responding to you, so you are going to take drastic measures. So Seth, I hope that helps. I think I've addressed the issue of limited literature already. Let's go back to the hands that are raised, and we'll come back to the chat. Andy, your hand is up. Please go ahead.
Hey, Madam, thanks for the education you have given us this time.
Yes.
My issue has to do with our search for literature to coming up with our research problems and our literature review. And some of the academic search engines, you may come across an article or a journal that you are interested in, but the access to it is always blocked.
Yeah.
And you may not be able to access the article.
Yeah.
That is a very big challenge to some of us. So I want to know if what we can do about it when we come across a situation.
Okay. There are two ways I usually address this, especially when I'm writing. I also I face the same problem, especially when I'm writing articles. One of the main sources of literature is the University of Ghana database. The University of Ghana spends several thousands of dollars every year paying for access to journal databases. Andy, my first question to you is, have you subscribed to the University of Ghana library database?
Yes, please, I have.
Have you subscribed to off-campus access?
Yes, I remember I went to the BAM library for them to do that for me.
Okay, so are you saying that all the articles that you are looking for
Hello.
your research, Andy, can you hear me?
Hello.
Andy, I can hear you, but can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, so are you saying that all the articles that you are looking for, you can't find most of them from the databases that the university subscribes to?
No. I don't mean it that way. I just, there are some few ones. Sometimes you go to Wiley's and you don't get the article.
Okay.
Because the institution has not paid for it. Because you are supposed to log in with the institution.
Okay.
And you are able to access it.
Yeah. Okay, so this is one trick that I use to access some of the articles that are not available through the institution. I use Google Scholar. Now, Google Scholar, aside academic databases, are able to pull versions of the papers that are existing and indexed on different platforms. So let me do a quick demonstration for you. When you go into Google Scholar and you enter a particular search term, let me quickly open Google Scholar so that we can demonstrate, okay? Please let me know as soon as you can see the Google Scholar. Please, can you see the browser I'm sharing?
Yes, you can see. Yeah, your screen is.
We can. Okay, so we are at scholar.google.com, right? I just entered it. It's going to open. So this is Google Scholar, where we usually go to look for articles. Now, Andy, give me a topic and let me enter the title.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. E-government. Electronic government.
Electronic government. Good.
Or e-government.
Okay. Okay, electronic government. So as soon as we enter it, you see it brings up a lot of options.
Exactly, yeah.
Good. Now, one way you can find some of the articles that you cannot find in the databases here is by using this PDF link near some of the options. Can you see it?
Yes, yes.
This link will usually take you to those articles that are open access on the platforms that they are listed on, or the versions of the articles that are saved on the computers of the owners or in some database somewhere on the internet. So you notice that this article is Springer. The University of Ghana does not pay for Springer, I believe. But if I wanted this article, I could go through this link. When I click on it, it will take me to ResearchGate, where the article is listed, and it will automatically pull it up for me. Do you see that?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So it has given me access to it. Even though UG does not pay for Springer, Google Scholar has helped me to gain access to it. So I just have to go and pull the citation from Springer and use it, and then use this to read through the article. So that is one key trick I use to find articles that are not available on the databases. I go through Google Scholar. And wherever it is hidden, as long as it's available on some website somewhere on the internet, Google will pull it in PDF form for me. Then there's another means that some researchers use, but it is illegal. They use this page where you can enter the DOI of the article, and it will automatically pull up the whole article for you wherever it is. But it is intellectual theft. And I do not promote it because I also write articles. If it's on a database and people don't want to pay for it, then they just download it free of charge, like me, I'll not be happy. So even though I know about it, I don't promote it. People here know what I'm talking about. See the way they are all responding. They're saying yeah, because they know. So Andy, I hope that answers your question. We know. Andy, I hope your question is answered.
Oh, could you repeat that one? We couldn't hear that.
Hey, no.
With the second option, I may have to see them.
Repeat it.
I'll repeat it. Hey, no.
Oh, please.
My VC doesn't have money to hire a lawyer.
Don't repeat it.
We are using our money to buy a laptop for students. So please, I don't want trouble. Okay, so Sadiq, yes, please go ahead. Then we'll continue in the chat. You're very welcome, Andy.
Thank you very much, Doc.
Yeah.
Doc, in downloading literature,
yeah,
I wanted to throw more light on it because some students also use student papers as a basis to write their thesis or long thesis. For example, I remember in my MPhil stages, my MPhil level, in the first proposal, I used one student paper, a PhD paper as a basis to write my problem statement, and you made mention of it's not a good thing to do. So
yeah,
and I know most students also having similar problems. So please, if
yeah,
you can throw more light on this for us.
yeah. Okay. So why would you base your entire work or significant portions of your work on a published student thesis, which in itself is not published work? Now, published theses are different from research articles because research articles have gone through the peer review process, right, which is very rigorous and addresses specific issues in depth and into detail. Now, here's the case you're using a student thesis where the students themselves have done an extensive literature review and have identified certain portions of the gaps using their own ideas. Remember when we talked about the compelling problem statement, we said you have to situate it in your own ideas and thoughts. You remember that? You remember?
Yes, dear.
Good. So if you are picking a student's PhD thesis or MPhil thesis that they are doing and basing your work on it, based on what I just said, what does it mean? Doesn't it mean that you are basing your thoughts on someone else's ideas? Isn't that what it means?
Yeah.
And in academia, we have a word for that. What do we call that? When you are taking somebody's ideas.
Plagiarism.
Thank you. So in essence, you are plagiarizing. Because the ideas are not yours. They are somebody's ideas that you have taken, that you are passing off as yours. So what you can do in using students' thesis is perhaps maybe some literature that they used and then use it as a guide to point you to certain literature. And then go and read those articles and use them based on your own understanding to formulate your own ideas and thoughts to incorporate into your work. So Sadiq, we don't encourage you basing your work on other students' theses because it's essentially plagiarism. Do you understand, Sadiq?
Yes, please, Doc. But Doc, one of my questions is about if the student papers can also form part of the basis to also develop the gaps in the
Why would you use another student's work as a basis? They did their systematic review and they found the gaps based on what they read. You to go and read and find what you will find and base your ideas on it. It's like you are trying to find a shortcut to doing the work, which will create problems. Because regardless of how methodical the systematic review is, everybody comes to the review process with their own thoughts and ideas. Are you aware, Sadiq?
Yes, please, Doc.
Good. So how I will interpret the findings of a study that I read is very different from how another person will interpret it. So one systematic review will not be the same as that of another person's. Even if they use the same articles, the conclusions they will draw and how they will extract the gaps will be significantly different. And that is why I'll not advise you to go and pick someone's thesis and use it as a basis for your work. It's a huge mistake, especially if you want to make a meaningful contribution to knowledge. For me, I'll not justify it in any sense. I hope you understand that, Sadiq.
Thank you, Doc. Yes, please.
Good. Okay, so back to the charts. Where were we? Okay, we are here. Afedel says, Jemima says, please, when your work exceeds the plagiarism mark, how do you go about it, or paraphrasing it? Okay. So when you see a plagiarism report, you see the point where the percentages begin at the end. There's a huge percentage page, isn't it? Where you see the overall similarity index. True or false?
True, madam.
Good. Now, after the overall similarity, you see the individual similarity indices.
Yeah.
Now, per University of Ghana requirement, the overall similarity index should be maximum 20%. True or false?
True.
And then the individual single source similarity indices should not be more than what percentage?
20.
No, the individual source similarity indices. No, it's not 1.
It's 2.
It's 2.
It's 2%.
2%. Good.
2 maximum.
Good. So if you have one that exceeds 2, like it is 3, then you have to go and locate what is making it that 3%. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but all of the single source similarity indices come in specific colors. Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
Good. Now, the color is what you use to track where the plagiarism is happening so that you can fix it. So, for example, you may have a 3% and it is colored orange. You go back to the work to look for the places that are highlighted in that orange color. Do you remember, are you with me?
Yes, ma'am.
So it is those portions that are highlighted in the orange color that you are going to paraphrase and rewrite. So as you are rewriting those portions, you keep rerunning to see if the rewriting that you are doing is bringing down that 3%.
Okay.
The moment it comes down to the 2%, you stop because you have satisfied the requirement.
What if in the case where the overall was 11, which is from UG space, and the rest is 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, making 20, but then your supervisor said he wants 15. So now where do you target?
I'm confused. I have to be able to see the report to understand what you are saying. Because if the overall is 11, and there is
UG space has 11.
The first single source is 11. I don't understand. UG space is
11, and the rest is 1, 1, 1, making a total of 20.
You are confusing me.
Prof,
Yeah.
I think I understand it. Can I come in?
Yes, Ray, come in.
So the overall she's saying the overall is 11, but the individual sources are 1, 1, 1. So what you do is that the overall meets the requirements, but the individual, the overall meet the requirement, but the individuals will be more than the 2%. I think that's what she wants to say.
No, she said all the individuals are 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. In that case, there's no problem.
There's no problem.
But there's a reference, plagiarism from UG space, making 11. We said 11. And then the rest is 1, 1, 1, making a total of 20%.
No, we don't combine the overall similarity and the single source similarity.
Okay,
they are different.
Maybe I'll have to send it to you so that you can explain. But now that I have to bring it down, I don't know.
And the single source are 1, 1, 1, 1. Then you don't have a problem.
Yeah.
Unless one of the single source is too high.
Yes, he has one single source.
She has one single source that is 11.
Yes.
Then that's a major problem. Good. So look at the color of that 11 and go and trace all the portions in your work that are highlighted in that color and start fixing them one by one.
Okay.
To bring it, because 11 is serious. It means you really lifted from that work. Hey, Jemima.
No.
It means you lifted and pasted. Bum, bum, bum. You didn't paraphrase anything. Hey, 11.
I did.
I've seen, the maximum I've seen is 9%. By 11 there, hey, you've gone far, please. Go back.
But it all makes up the 20, so I don't know.
No, overall is fine, but single source you have violated. Single source per the UG plagiarism policy should be maximum 2%. So go and trace where the 11% is occurring using the color of that 11% in the main work and start paraphrasing section by section and then rerun.
All right.
So you keep doing that until the 11 comes down to 2, then you are fine.
All right. Okay.
It is well. God is with you, Jemima. You are very welcome.
Hello, Doc.
Yes.
I think just a quick one. So aside the colors, if you look at the individual references, it comes with numbers.
Yeah.
So when you go to your document, you see they are numbered. The color comes with a number, so you can trace if it's the first one, then you check the numbering.
Yeah,
so if you have a problem with colors, you can just check the numbers. Then
very good.
That will help.
Very good. Thank you for adding that, Ray. Awesome. Okay, so the next comment is from Mohammed. Please, is ethical clearance not needed for an MPhil thesis data collection? As at now, I think it is a requirement for PhD. I'm not sure for MPhil. I'll have to find out. But you can go for ethical clearance as an MPhil student as well. But I know it's a requirement for PhDs. If they do not do the ethical clearance, they are not allowed to proceed. But I'll check that. I'll check that out of the MPhils.
It is a requirement, please.
The ethical clearance for MPhils. What department?
Nursing.
Nursing. Okay. Yes. Yours is sensitive because it's science. Yeah. For humanities. For humanities, sometimes because of course recently I've graduated 2 MPhil students. They didn't go for ethical clearance. So I'll have to find out what the rules say for the MPhil students, particularly those in the humanities in my school. I'll check. Mohammed, I know why you're asking. You want to know whether you have to go for it. So I'll check and get back to you, okay, Mohammed?
Okay, thank you.
All right. Now the second part of your question. In discussing your findings, which one is more relevant to refer to? The objectives or the literature review? Both. So you start by categorizing the findings by objective. And then you juxtapose the findings with your literature review to see places where your findings confirm the literature and where your findings contradict the literature, and propose a plausible explanation for why you think that is occurring. Does that make sense, Mohammed?
Please, yes, please.
Yes, so you do both.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And then Miss Mikey says, did you say that anecdotal evidence can be used in the background statement? Yes, it can. Is this for long essay or thesis inclusive? Both. So we use the funnel approach. You start from the anecdotal and then you narrow down to the empirical to show that indeed the phenomenon is happening in real life and there's empirical literature to justify that it occurs. Okay, so you do it for both long essay and thesis. You're welcome, Miss Mikey. Okay, so the rest are well wishes. Laurentia says, very insightful. You're very welcome, Laurentia. Same from Dorothy. Okay, then we have Maud. Okay, so Maud says, sometimes I make time and read all or at least the largest part to help me understand the paper in an in-depth manner and even get more articles from the paper to review for my work. That's very true. Right? So that is when you are actually taking your time to do the systematic review properly. You go through the papers and it helps you to be able to find additional literature, to be able to write better and even get to know more about the issue that you are studying. Okay, Ghazali also has some nice comments. Thank you very much, Ghazali. Elizabeth says, please, is it necessary for your supervisor to edit or change your topic entirely? Yes. For me, up until the day I submitted my final corrections, my topic changed. My topic changed twice. Before I submitted for marking, and then after my Viva, before I submitted my final corrections, my topic changed. So the topic can change at any time. So please don't select a topic and fall in love with it and put up opposition when it is being modified. Because up until you collect your data and change your finding and discuss your findings, your topic can change. Research is iterative. You keep going back and forth and updating specific sections with relevant information until you finally hand in the work and say, I'm done. And even if you say I'm done, like I said, in my case, after my work came back from marking, based on the comments of the examiners, I had to modify my topic to include a variable that emerged out of my findings, which I did not include initially in the main work. So your topic can change entirely. Okay, Elizabeth.
And Madam, did that refer you, or you were passed, but you had to do the correction?
No, it wasn't a major correction. It was something that was already in my work, and they thought it will enhance it if I added that variable to the topic. Do you understand?
Okay.
So it's not a referral. It was already in the work. They thought that I have not in the topic, so it is not making it apparent. So I should just put it in the topic, and I did that. Okay, good.
All right, thank you, Madam.
You're welcome, Lisbeth. Anita says, why are we always making excuses for supervisors while supervision is part of their duties? Sometimes this excuse leads students into desperate situations. Anita, we are not making excuses. We're not saying the supervisor should not do their work. We are just saying that you should give them the opportunity to do their work and do it well. Right? Anita, it's like the supervisor telling you that finish writing your chapter 1 in 2 days for me to read. It's not possible. So you have to be able to define your timelines and give the supervisor ample opportunity to respond to you. And the supervisors are also human beings, like I said. They have a lot going on. So you have to make sure that you do everything on your part as a student, following due protocol, so that if the supervisor is not fulfilling their end of the bargain, you can use the relevant means to seek redress. We cannot ignore the fact that student numbers are high and so the supervisors have high workloads. So saying this is not excusing them. Saying this is taking cognizance of the fact that based on the circumstances they find themselves in, there will be challenges where they will not be able to read your work and give it to you when you need it. There may be challenges where sometimes your work may take a bit longer to review than it usually does. All we are asking is that you accommodate and prepare for these contingencies when they come up. But this is not in any way rubbishing those who have genuine problems with their supervisors. And like I said, there are avenues that have been created by the university for you to seek redress in such circumstances. Okay, so Anita, I'm not making excuses for supervisors. I'm just saying that let's make sure that everybody is doing their part, and then we are using the right avenues to seek redress where we feel aggrieved. Okay, so Anita, I hope you understand my sentiments for sharing what I was sharing. I was in no way trying to make excuses for supervisors. Okay. All right. Zina says, explain the research questions and how to go about it. So the research questions are basically the question form of your research objectives. And the research objectives emerge from your research problem. So if you do not have a good research problem, which will lead you into the purpose of your study, you will not be able to clearly identify the objectives that you want to address. And without objectives, there is no way you can have research questions, because like I said, the questions are the question form of the research objectives that you have. So Zina, I hope that helps. Maud says, I remember the submission window was on the Grassac platform. Okay, so Grassac will keep on doing that to keep reminding you so that you do not miss the submission windows. Toby says, some supervisors say they don't do communication through emails. So each time you have to print your work and submit to their office. That one I cannot answer for because I am the exact opposite. I function very effectively using emails and email submissions because then I can do track changes and then I can track the progress of the work that you are doing and the corrections that I'm giving you to do. So I cannot speak to those supervisors who insist on submitting your work in hard prints to their office, but I'm sure they have their reasons, right? So like I said, these are the few nuances that could emerge in the supervisor-student relationship. And sometimes you have to learn to accommodate them, right? Especially where it is helping you to be able to progress in your work. Because sometimes there are some supervisors who find it difficult working online or on the computer for long periods. But if the work is in hard copy, they can be able to read and give you feedback faster. I remember when I was doing my PhD, my supervisor was one of those. He would usually wake up at dawn, pick your work, sit down and read and write and do copious comments by hand in the book because that was his way of doing it. He was more old school, right? So depending on your supervisor and their style, they may prefer this. But if this is what they are asking for and it is helping you to progress in the supervision process and get good feedback for your work, Toby, I'll just ask that you accommodate and bear with them and then get your feedback and finish your work in good time. Okay, so I hope that helps. Elizabeth says, in terms of gap in literature, when your topic is related to a case study in an institution, what are you to concern gap in literature? How can you base your entire work on a case study? So this is where students are doing research and it is not based on any identifiable issue in literature, but they are basing it on anecdotal things that they have experienced. So Elizabeth, right from the onset, your impetus for doing the work is flawed. Because in your case, you may think because it's happening in an institution or an organization, this is an issue. But in the literature, it may not be an issue of relevance. And when it comes to research, you need adequate evidence from the literature to show that this issue that you are trying to address is worth pursuing and is of relevance in the area that you are studying. So I'll not advise you to pick a topic because you see a case happening in a particular institution and you think it's interesting, so you want to study it. I see a lot of MBA students doing this, especially those who are workers and want to build the MBA around their place of work so that they can collect data easily and analyze and go. It is not a good way to write a long essay or thesis. So I'll not advise you to go that route, because if you are going that route, then you will not find any gaps in literature, because it means the issue that you are addressing empirically has no basis. So Elizabeth, if you are doing this, please retrace your steps. Emmanuel Kuje says, under what chapter is it suitable to write your philosophical underpinnings? For this one, everybody can answer you. Emmanuel, please, what chapter do we write the philosophical underpinnings in?
I understand. Listen to me.
Please, what chapter do we write the philosophical underpinnings in?
Doc, please, I think he's in a car, so the place is so loud. That's why he's not
Okay.
with us.
Yeah, but it's a general question. To
In chapter
everybody.
3.
What is chapter 3? What's the name of the chapter?
Methodology.
Methodology chapter. Remember, I showed you the research onion, where we said it begins with the philosophical underpinnings. You remember? Then
Yes,
from
Prof.
the philosophical underpinnings, you go in to talk about the approach to theory development, which could be deduction, abduction, or induction. Then you go to your methodological choice, whether quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods. Then you go to the specific strategy. Are you using survey, case study, action research? Then you go into the time horizon. Is it a cross-sectional study or a longitudinal study? Then you go into the data collection process, your sampling strategy, the sample size that you use, the analytical techniques, and then you go in to talk about your ethical considerations. So Emmanuel, you discuss philosophical underpinnings under the methodology chapter. Okay. Mohammed says, will you have to reference the problem statement in your write-up? I'm confused. Mohammed, can you clarify that a bit? While Mohammed clarifies, Emmanuel says, how many times can you run your work through Turnitin? You can run it through a multiple number of times. What you have to do.
Hello, Doc.
What you have to do. Yes, Mohammed. Please, a moment.
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Okay, he's gone off again.
Hello, Doc.
Yes, Mohammed. Yes, I can hear you now.
Yes, so what I'm just trying to see is that in your problem statement, will you have to, actually reference them? I did my proposal defense, that was 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
And I actually didn't reference it. So the panel was like, my problem statement, why is it that I didn't reference it?
Yes. How did you come up with the problem statement if we don't know the references that you base your problem statement on?
Okay.
So you have to give us the sources, the articles that you cited. You have to reference us so that we can be, okay, he read this paper and that paper, and this is where he got this idea from, and that's where he got this idea from. So the panel is spot on.
So it has to always be referenced, right?
Yes, please. Always.
Okay. All right. Very well. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Mohammed. So, Emmanuel, you can enter your work in Turnitin several number of times, but there's a caveat. Every time you enter your work into Turnitin, there's a particular setting. It's called submit document to institutional repository or submit document to repository. You have to make sure that this particular setting is unchecked the first time you are entering your work. Why? Because if you do not uncheck it and it is checked, as soon as you submit it in Turnitin, it is submitted to the repository. So the next time you come back and rerun, it will give you back 100% plagiarism or 90% or 80% thereabout, because it will see that you are plagiarizing a work that has already been submitted, even though it's your own work. So you have to uncheck that option. I'm sure most of you use the University of Ghana Turnitin, isn't it?
Yes, Doc.
Yes, please.
Good. Now, when you are submitting it, in submitting it to Sakai, there's an option. There's an option that you can select, right? If I was creating an assignment for my students and I asked that they submit it to Turnitin, for instance, I will have to set that feature, right? Because I am creating the assignment. So when I create the assignment, I'll usually set the feature and say that do not submit to institutional repository, right? Or do not submit to repository. Meaning that if the student submits their work and it runs through Turnitin, it should not be submitted to the repository, so that they can be able to run it several times, assuming they run it and their work is not good in terms of plagiarism. Let me quickly show you in Sakai. Let me know if you can see the screen that I'm sharing. Please, can you see it?
Yes, please.
Now, this is my back end because I'm setting an assignment. If you are submitting it to Sakai, you see something similar like this with the Turnitin plagiarism service section. Can you see that?
Yes.
Now, as soon as I click use Turnitin, you see options will drop. Now, under options, you see submit papers to the following repository. Do you see that?
Yes, please.
Good. The first one is none. And then the second one is what? Standard paper repository. Now, automatically, standard paper repository is checked. Can you see that?
Yes, please, we can.
It means that as soon as you submit your work and Turnitin runs, it will add it to the database. So if you come back and you run it again, Turnitin will give you 80% plus because you are plagiarizing yourself. So before you run your work, you have to make sure you click none under submit papers to the following repository. Am I making sense?
Yes, please.
So that when you run it, it will not submit it to the database. So if you come back and you run it again, you have to go through the same process, select none, so that it will not submit any version of your work to the database. Otherwise, any subsequent run of Turnitin that you do, it will say that you are plagiarizing yourself and it will give you a high plagiarism score. Am I making sense?
Yes, please.
Good.
So
whenever you are running Turnitin on Sakai, make sure you uncheck that box and select none for submitting the paper to the repository, so that it will not submit it to the repository and then you can run it again after you have run it that time, so that it will not give you a high plagiarism, thinking that you are plagiarizing yourself. Okay. Good. So, Emmanuel,
Please, when you are sending it to Turnitin, you just have to copy only the work without the tables or...
Yes, just the
when you are sending it to plagiarism, you only pick the chapters.
Yes, you remove the tables. And you can also even remove the abstracts in the cover page.
Okay. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Then Divine says, can you use Google Scholar APA style referencing? Yes, you can. But in my experience, I've realized that sometimes they leave out some of the important things. The APA versions that exist, you will notice that the variations are very minute. Sometimes it's just in the position of a comma or a full stop. What I've noticed with Google is that they do not use a particular APA referencing style. They just do it in general. So for example, if your supervisor is asking you to use the 7th edition or the 9th edition or the 8th edition, there are certain minute differences that you will miss. So it is important for you, even though you use the Google APA, to just use it to give you the general structure and then refer back to the specific APA version that you are using to see if everything that is supposed to be there is represented. That every comma is where it's supposed to be. Every full stop is where it's supposed to be, so that you do not make mistakes. Okay. So Ferdinand, although it's good to use the Google Scholar, like I said, it makes mistakes and leaves out important things.
Yes,
right?
madam, well noted.
So it's important for you to check it against the plagiarism version that you are using to make sure that everything is represented. Martin says plagiarism 90% all day. Yes, I've seen some before, and that was because the person didn't uncheck that box, and therefore the software was seeing that they are plagiarizing themselves. That's why they got 98%. Yeah. Okay, then who's next? Okay, so the rest are all well wishes. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm most grateful for your kind words. I receive it all in Jesus' name. Yes, okay, so Ferdinand has put my email address in the chat. That's my email address. So please feel free to reach out if you want to ask me any question or you want to address any issues. Solomon, your hand is up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hello, Doc. I was following the section you go to uncheck the plagiarism, but I couldn't follow it properly.
Oh, let me share it again.
Yes, please.
Please, can you see the screen?
Yes, please, I can see.
Good. So the section I'm hovering over is Turnitin Plagiarism Service. When you click use Turnitin, it will bring a drop-down menu. Now, when you scroll down, you see submit papers to repository, this option. You see it? Good.
Yes, please.
Now, automatically, this option is always checked because they assume that you will run it only once. But there is the opportunity for you to run it multiple times, especially if the report comes back and it's no good. So to be able to make sure you use that opportunity and it does not see that you are self-plagiarizing, you uncheck this and rather check none.
Okay.
So that you can be able to resubmit your work again. And it will not see that you are plagiarizing. So every time you resubmit your work, make sure you go and check this option and make sure that you have selected none. So that it does not see that you are plagiarizing yourself. Otherwise, you start getting 80% and 90%. Meanwhile, it's your own work.
All right, Doc. Sorry, I wanted to know where you go before you come here, actually. That was...
Okay, so I went to assignments, right? Because I was setting up an assignment for a student.
Oh, okay.
So usually it will ask me if I want them to run, if I want their submissions to be run through Turnitin. Good. But if you were submitting your work into Turnitin, there is a portion that has been created for you. I believe UGCS used to create a dummy course like that. Grasa, is UGCS still doing that? They used to create a dummy course in Sakai. Very good.
Yes.
Yes, please. Yes.
Good. So I think in that dummy course, they have unchecked the submit to repository option.
Okay.
So if they have done that, then it means that you are free to submit however number of times, and it will not submit to the repository, and it will not give you any self-plagiarism results.
Okay, Doc. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, who do we have? There was another hand up, or their issue has been addressed. That's Vida.
Yes, Doc. I'd like to know if there's a difference between research method and research methodology.
Okay, so the methodology is what we know as the quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods, right? Some people call it the research approach. Okay, so the research methodology is the research approach. And then the research method is a strategy. Are you with me? Right, are you
yes,
there?
Please.
Good.
Yes, please.
So the research method or strategy is the survey, case study, narrative, action research, those are the specific methods, right? Or strategies.
Okay.
And then the methodology or approach is the quantitative, qualitative mixed methods. Please, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, please. Thank you very much.
We thank God. Okay, so still on the chats. Okay, Idrisu says, can we have another session on this? Sadiq and team, over to you. Oliver says, thank you, Doc. Same from Francisca. My pleasure. You are all very welcome. I'm happy to have been of help. Eric says the dummy course for running the plagiarism on Sakai is RCOM. So please, if you want to use Sakai to run your plagiarism, just look for the dummy course called RCOM that UGCS has created to help you to run your plagiarism report. Sadiq, you were saying something.
Yes, but Doc, since you are answering questions, I want you to finish before we end the session.
Yes, please. Okay, so Zina says, what do you do when you get self-plagiarism? So in that case, you will have to contact UGCS to remove your paper from the repository. And that's a very long process, right? But the only option is to get the one who is on the back end of the software, which in the case of University of Ghana is UGCS, to go into the system and remove your paper from the repository. That is the only way that that self-plagiarism will stop. Right? Otherwise, it will keep showing up every time you rerun it. Daniel says, yes.
In case you have written your article, then you are quoting it or you are using portions in an assignment. You know, you've published articles saying business and financial times.
That's self-plagiarism. You can't do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So still on Daniel Darko, he says, after completing your systematic review, can it replace the literature review section in the thesis? No, it cannot. The systematic review will only help you to unearth the gaps. So you still need the literature review to discuss the gaps and the issues. And if it's quantitative, formulate hypotheses to explain the relationships between the variables, and then ultimately develop a conceptual framework. So after you do the systematic review to unearth the gaps, you still have to go on to discuss the gaps that you have identified, including the ones that your study will be focusing on, and how you are going to go about using those to develop your conceptual framework for the study. So that is what it is, Daniel. I hope you understand. H says, in that case, research method is same as design. No, research design is not research method. Research design is everything from your philosophical choice to your methodological choice to your choice of approach to your choice of strategy. All that is design from A to Z. That is not the method. So H, I hope that makes sense. Yeah. So yes, so I think we've come to the end of the chats where Idrisu is asking for another session. That one is up to the GRASAC team to determine. But like I said, I'm more than happy to be of help and to help you find the process a bit more bearable, right? And to expedite the completion of your long essays and thesis. So on that note, I'll end the session here. Thank you very much to everyone who participated. Thank you for all your questions and comments. I'm most grateful and happy to have been of service. Sadiq, please, over to you.
Thank you, madam. We really appreciate your service here. On behalf of my colleagues and I, we want to say thank you very much. And we will be coming to your office. It was a wonderful session with you. We loved you for that. And your level of patience, so great. Thank you very much once again.
Very welcome, Ferdinand. Thank you very much to the team at GRASAC. I'm most grateful. So on that note, I think we can end the session here. Sadiq, can we do that?
Yes, please, Doc. As Ferdinand said, we are most grateful for, although we sent a message late, but we're able to respond quickly and then we thank you very much. We hope to engage you further in the new year.
Always available to serve. Always available to serve. You're very welcome, Sadiq. Thank you, everyone. Yes, Sadiq.
Doc, I also want to thank the students for also, participating in the session. We hope that to also, follow the and also do a good job this right out to meet the schools. Yes, but Doc, we hope for that to receive the email of the slides and then the recordings as well.
I'll send the slides to you, and then I'll also send a link for the recording. Okay, then. Enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone. Take care.
All right, same to you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
All right.